Good morning. This is the Father's Ed podcast from Fathercraft. I'm your co-host, Paul Rhodes.
And I'm your other host, Chris Marchant.
Chris, we're recording this on the morning of Good Friday, half an hour before we both head out for the day, and 2 days after we said we were going to record it because we have had manic weeks. What are your plans for today? Where are you going with the family?
So we've got actually loads of the extended family around. So actually out in Spain at the moment. So, first world problems for me. So we're going to spend most of the day just on the beach, take the kids out, let them run around, and try not to get burnt, basically.
Very good. Our day is remarkably similar. We are also going to the beach, although whilst you're in a beach in Catalonia, we are going to be on a beach in Cleethorpes. So perhaps a little bit of a difference in the weather. It's very grey here. And also a disappointment. We tried to book into Steels, but we tried too late. So we're having to go to Papa's. For anyone who's listening to this who isn't au fait with northeast Lincolnshire, Steels is the best fish and chip restaurant around. And I am devastated we haven't been able to get in. I've been going since I was a child, and my kids absolutely love it too. So, but it'll be nice to try somewhere else, and I will report back on how it is.
And genuinely, I'm slightly jealous of the Cleethorpes Beach. I know it well from childhood also, but it's got the donkey rides one, if I remember still. And my eldest absolutely just loves everything to do with donkeys, horses, the whole thing. So he'd be a little disappointed to hear that he can't join your boy on a little donkey ride, which would make his day.
Indeed. It's going to be a good time. But we're not here to talk about the differences between Catalonia and Cleethorpes. We are here to talk about parenting, about fatherhood, and about our experiences. And since this is our first proper episode, I just thought it'd be a good idea to maybe give everyone a bit of a background as to why, maybe not even just why we're doing the podcast, but why actually we decided to start Fathercraft. And we're going to let you talk about that because it was your idea initially for us to do it. You've had lots of ideas over the years, and we haven't necessarily pursued any of them together until this one. I think because it resonated with both of us so much. So do you just want to let everyone know the background to why we started Fathercraft?
For those that listen to this, Paul and I have known each other for 25 plus odd years now. So
Quarter of a century.
Quarter of a century. So when he says that, he says it both with love and with factual accuracy. The short story of how we came to do it was, I think it was like a lot of dads. And in an episode later on, Dan Flanagan says it quite well, is he did just to kind of help him figure out what happened and to be almost cathartic, starting a blog format, looking into getting what happened down in some kind of content format, and then finding that it resonated with others. For those that don't know, Fathercraft actually started in the US originally, with John, Paul and Mark over there. And I actually found them while struggling to kind of comprehend what happened with my first. We had a difficult 2 sets of births, me and my wife. And I was feeling a little bit lost, was just kind of searching for some validation and community and understanding. I was struggling actually to find things that were genuinely kind of proactively focused towards partners and fathers. We did the NCT one during lockdown, so it was all Zoom calls, which was good, but not quite as beneficial as I was hoping, if I was honest. We still keep in touch with a couple of them afterwards once we actually got to meet up, which is great. But I really did learn to value the idea of having a network and a community. And so got chatting with the guys there, their content resonated and said, why don't you do this in the UK more formally? And it was a capacity thing there. So we said, well, we'd love to do it. It helped me. I'd like to use it to help others. And then we got chatting and started actually, pull a structure of what it could be together. As you'll all find out as we kind of progress through this season, is I might come up with loads of ideas and concepts and slightly more taking nerdy bits every now and then. Paul is a much more focused mind. And so my wife in particular was very happy, Paul, when you agreed to do it as a joint venture because it kind of complemented. So And on the side, I'd highly recommend to anyone to do something that they feel passionate about with their oldest and best friend.
Yeah, absolutely. When you came to me with the idea, it just really resonated. My son was born in the first few months of the pandemic, so I think my expectations of what parenthood would be like were completely turned upside down by the fact that everything was closed down. There were no services and no support available. Even those last few months of pregnancy, I wasn't allowed to go into the appointments. And then obviously on the day he was born, it was only a matter of hours before, right, that's it, you're thrown out. And that was really difficult. Coming home without being able to see anyone, without grandparents being able to come round and hold their new grandchild. It was really difficult. So I think, of course, that hopefully is a once in a generation, once in multiple generation thing that, not many people will have to go through. But I think just recognizing that, all of our parenting journeys are different. We all struggle in different ways. There's no manual for being a dad, for being a parent. And actually, that if we can play some small part in helping other people through sharing our experiences, through the written guidance that is on our website, the blogs, which we're trying to get better at, and then our Father's Ed platform as well, where we've kind of distilled all of the guidance into short form video content, then hopefully we can play some role in that. And, so far the feedback we've got has been really great.
Yeah, it really has. You try to do it with an element of humility of saying the big dream and vision when we embarked on this journey was to try and create a platform and a central repository where you could find and stitch together what you need, because we learned the hard way that there is no one route, but a lot of times you were told that there's a one routine that will work, and there's an expectation about what the birthing journey and delivery. I mean, the birth plans that I wrote were useless almost 10 seconds after we actually put them down. And this is one on this one, but I mean, across, we both have two children each. I've got two boys. Paul's got a boy and a girl. I mean, what your eldest was born in the pandemic. Your girl was actually a relatively regular-ish, if I can say it that way, kind of birthing
Yes,
journey.
it's so regular and so straightforward. She was almost born in the pub.
Which, I mean, there's a story there for a later date, and I'm sure we'll share it if you're happy to. But I mean, my eldest was born at the tail end of the pandemic. But my eldest had an induction. Lasted 123 hours. That time frame is burnt into my mind with the consequences of COVID tests and limited access as well. Not the same as what you went through, Paul. With you had a crazy one with your eldest. And like with the scans as well, just access was difficult. So it was a very different experience from what the books tell you is going to happen, at least in theory. My youngest was a preemie. He was 7 weeks early. He was neonatal, so we didn't take him home for 3 weeks. And so, we speak from experience of going through, wanting to have a normal journey and not having any until actually your girl, which I think surprised you more than anything else, was that there were limited-ish consequences to at least the birthing kind of side and the labour, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, I mean it was so straightforward. To the extent where we sent my wife's parents home
Always goes down well.
because we didn't think anything was necessarily going to happen that evening, and then half an hour in, we're in the car going to the hospital. But yeah, it was so much nicer, just that experience of being in the hospital under normal circumstances. It was nighttime. We could look out the window and Lincoln Cathedral was lit up looking beautiful, which is, just amazing. And then, yeah, after she was born, just the calm of being able to be there together and relax and take our time. It was a lovely experience, to be honest, the second time. Very different to the first, obviously very different to yours, very different to everyone's. Everyone's experiences are completely different. And that's something we're going to be delving into on the show. We're going to be having weekly guests. And one of the things we're always really keen to hear from them, yes, about their professional experience and the expertise that they've got to bring to the conversations around parenting and fatherhood, particularly, but actually what's their experience of being a parent themselves. What did they find challenging, what did they find surprising? And I'm really really excited to have some of those conversations. We're also going to be delving into current affairs, or at least to the extent that they impact on parents. We're not going to go full Today program, but whether that's parental leave, whether it's childcare costs, whether it's other campaigns that are in the news, just things that I think you'll find really is interesting as listeners because they affect your lives as a parent.
Yeah, and that was kind of the thing, wasn't it? Where we started talking about doing a podcast was not just kind of jump on a train or add something else out there. I mean, there were plenty now signed in this space, which is great. What we want to do is kind of bring it from just a kind of a regular dad point of view as we go through it as much as anybody else. And we've been quite lucky as part of this journey. We've met some great people. We've had some great advice and mentoring, and we've just learned a boatload. And it started to get to a point where we were learning more than we could put through what the platform currently exists as. And it just seemed almost a waste not to share some of that interaction and some of those learnings. And the podcast kind of lets us have that more informal conversational approach to what are, in a lot of ways, quite difficult topics, but also to give you a little peek behind the curtain of the motivations for some of those people who have really started kind of changing where people go. I mean, we've got some great guests coming on. I'm a huge fan of Dan Flanagan, Dad Lasol. He has had one hell of a journey. There's such a range of people. And
Speaking of guests, the interview we're doing today is with Professor Anna Tarrant. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Lincoln, a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow, and she's also the founder and the centre director of the Centre for Innovation in Fatherhood and Family Research. It's a really interesting conversation. Anna has done a huge amount of research around fatherhood, but specifically around young fathers. She's published a couple of books on the subject. And it's a really, really interesting conversation. She's doing some really fantastic work around father inclusion, including looking at what father inclusion strategies for localities could look like. And she's also launched something called the Father Inclusion Hub, which is an absolutely fantastic online resource that brings together research around parenting and fatherhood, links to different groups that are working on this subject. And it's just a really fantastic resource, I think, for anyone working in the sector.
yeah, she's doing some great work with the Father Inclusion Hubs. One of the bits, because we touched on is we learned that depending on where you are and depending on the actual resource that you're accessing, the support you're accessing, sometimes it can feel like a little left out as a dad or father. And Anna is doing some brilliant work on not just the evidence base as to what the outputs and improvements can be by engaging fathers within the process more actively, but also helping to train and to support services and organizations on how they can do that in a way that adds value, doesn't take away. It's often the conversation is too much framed around this zero-sum game of to improve support or access on for fathers, you have to take it away from mothers. It's just not that. Everyone benefits by improved services. And she's been leading the charge on that. So she's done some brilliant work in that field.
So, without further ado, let's get to that interview now. The first thing I wanted to ask Anna is about your route into academia. Is it something you've always wanted to do? Was that always the plan for you?
Yeah, just mainly for a lack of not really knowing what I wanted to do in general, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I always knew at secondary school that I really wanted to go into university. I was of the sort of Blair era when 50% of students were encouraged to go. So it was something I wanted to do. I was academic at school, which didn't always go down well with some of my peers, but it was something that I've always been passionate about. I actually went to university to do geography, social geography. I'm a sociologist now, but I think I've always kind of been a bit interdisciplinary. So what I mean by that is that I kind of don't really subscribe to one particular discipline. I just like to learn and learn more about different concepts and ways of thinking that are critical of the way we live the world. And it was my undergraduate dissertation that got me into this area of research to look at fatherhood and men's care responsibilities. So I did a focus group about my granddad and his experience of family life. He and some of his friends and people I knew from my local area came and talked about their love for their grandchildren, observed the fact that they're very rarely asked about what it means to be a granddad, and the surprise that I was asking those kinds of questions. They told me a lot about how their roles were gendered. So if they were still with their wives or with their partners, they talked about how they did a lot of the domestic work, but the granddads did more of the fixing and the sort of hands-on work. So I thought it was really interesting, just that kind of gendered division of labour and how that extended across the life course for these men. But also what was really striking was about the time that they had, that they didn't have when they were fathers, to actually invest in a caregiving role for their grandchildren. So that was kind of formative, really, because when I carried on into my academic career, I did a range of different roles, some teaching, but some research, looking at, again, the role of fathers, but in child protection contexts. So kind of more at the hard end of family life, really, and where there's sort of social intervention of some kind. And again, I was really struck by the different gendered ways that men would seek advice and support about how to support their grandchildren, particularly in cases where there was a child protection concern, or where children were being placed either within the family or potentially into care. And a lot of the men who were ringing this advice and advocacy line that I was researching at the time were just very practically focused on, how do we get a new house? How do we get the space we need to care for these children when we didn't expect to? How do we talk to lawyers and talk to professionals in the family courts about what we need, and what we need to secure? And that was very different in its orientation to the way some of the grandmothers and the women were ringing the advice line. So I ended up staying in academia and staying doing research. Managed to secure funding to do a variety of different projects that shifted into the arena of looking at men's care responsibilities in low-income communities. I was really kind of aware of a range of different sort of policy narratives about men in those contexts that were really kind of problematic. They're often described as sort of in deficit ways, as absent and as feckless, and a language that's re-emerged recently, actually, that whole communities might be fatherless, and that there are men deserts, and I found that really difficult as a language. Because the data that was being used was based on households, so it wasn't actually capturing the full picture of family life and the diversity of family life and the ways in which men sustain their relationships with children across households. But also because, again, it wasn't really reflective of the evidence that we have. So when I was doing my research over time, I was talking to men in low-income communities as caregivers, and they were telling me lots about what they do for their grandkids, for their kids, and what they've done over time, but no one was capturing it. So I developed some research studies to capture what it is that men in low-income family contexts do. That resulted in a book called Fathering in Poverty, and that looks at young fathers, so men who are aged 25 and under when they first become a parent, single fathers, so who no longer with partner, and then also male kinship carers, so granddads, uncles, anyone who takes on care responsibilities for a child. When parents no longer able to, and that work just really countered this idea of fecklessness and absence, and helped me to see that actually, if we look at these men as failed breadwinners, we don't see what they do for their families and the work that's involved and invested in sustaining their families over time. So by this point, I've caught the research bug. I'm still in academia. I haven't left. I ended up getting a permanent position at the University of Lincoln, and that was as a sociology lecturer. And around about sort of 3 or 4 years into that role, a research funding stream came up called the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship Scheme, and that was all about supporting future research leaders. I've been developing quite a complex set of impact-based projects about how we co-create dads groups, particularly with young fathers. And I built a project essentially around that, and developed a study called Volume Fathers Further. So it took forward the work with the young dads that I'd sort of been developing in Fathering in Poverty, but allowed me to look at their parenting journeys over time and to connect into another study called Following Young Fathers. And yeah, I'm kind of 6 years into that study now, or 5.5 into that study, maybe 6 years. I'll talk a bit more about it later in the podcast if you have more questions about it. But essentially, it's led to this broader theorisation, if you like, or focus on father inclusion and father inclusive practices and services and policies, and really thinking about, based on the findings from that whole programme of research, how we shift away from negative and or shaming languages that assign blame really to fathers, either for being absent or, or not supporting mums, to, well, actually, how do we support fathers to be there? This is driven a lot by my own personal sort of interests. Actually, from a very positive side, really. My grandparents, my granddad particularly on my mum's side, was incredibly involved in my life and incredibly supportive, as reflected by his involvement in my research as an undergraduate student. My own dad, again, really heavily involved in my life and that of my sisters. Surrounded by my mum and sisters, he's done an amazing job. Just kind of wanted to sort of explore a world where everyone had some form of male figure in their life that was supportive of them. And, we know from research that involved fathers are positive for boys, for girls. It's beneficial to women as well. Not necessarily to the extent where people have to be in a relationship with one another still, but once we can find common ground between men and women, we're much more able to develop society in a progressive way. And I've just been very interested in that and how we do that through the lens of father inclusion.
You mentioned your granddad and obviously how he's been really a positive influence in your own life. I wonder, when you were doing that original focus group with him and talking to him about his own experiences of parenthood
Yeah.
and fatherhood specifically, what whether he reflected on, obviously, how his experience actually was, but whether he had any reflections on whether he felt he'd missed out somewhat
Mm.
in terms of just the way things are so different today than they were back then. And that's, not to say that he himself wasn't a good father, but I wonder whether he thinks actually, if it had been a different time, whether he'd have
Mm.
actually wanted to be more involved if he had, and if society was different back then.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, not just him, but the men that I interviewed for my PhD study on grandfatherhood, a lot of them expressed regret that they hadn't had more time. It's very interesting, that research, because I would go in with quite an open set of questions and say, "Tell me about yourself," and they'd launch straight into their work histories. So even though I was talking about them being granddads, the first thing they told me was about their jobs, and then I'd say, "Well, tell me about being a granddad and what that means." And it's a really important part of their lives, and it's a part of their lives where they're learning. So they do reflect back on when they were a father, and they say, there are regrets that I was working long hours or didn't really have the time to invest in my children that I can now enjoy with my grandchildren. So it becomes almost redemptive for them in some ways. So I'll spend that time with my grandchildren because that supports my children in the here and now, but it also enables me to engage in the kinds of love and care that I didn't necessarily or couldn't necessarily when I was younger. And again, there's some really interesting intergenerational kind of observations going on as well. So a lot of them say, I'm observing my son changing nappies and I want to change nappies. And they would ask and they would say to mum or even to grandma, "Can I change the nappy?" So there's still a slight gendered element to that because they sort of felt they needed to ask the permissions to do it. But they were getting really hands on and really stuck in. And again, it was a space and an opportunity to try new things and to do more of the direct care work and some of the domestic work as well. Predominantly, it was the care work.
A lot of your work is focusing on young fathers.
Yeah.
Was that a conscious decision to focus on that specific age group rather than on first-time fathers, say, in general?
Mm. Um, no. So it was actually informed by some engagement that I had with an existing research study. So as part of fathering and poverty study, I did a secondary analysis or engaged with some existing data from a study called Following Young Fathers that was being led by Bren Neal and Carmen Lau Clayton. That project started in 2012 and I went to Leeds in 2014. And it was in doing the sort of secondary analysis work that I really became much more interested in the young fatherhood research. For me, what was so fascinating was the sort of policy practice dynamics and how we get to see those through the narratives and experiences of particular cohorts of men. So I kind of went from this very sort of end of life course focus very quickly to start of life course focus. And what these men have in common is the challenges of being seen and heard as fathers and as caregivers, of any value being accorded to that by society, while at the same time being denigrated and vilified as apparently absent and feckless. But the Following Your Fathers study originally came from an engagement that Bren Neal had with professionals. So it was towards the sort of end of the teenage pregnancy strategy. She went along to a teenage strategy meeting and said, I want to do some research on young mums. And a professional at the council said, look, we've got an evidence base about young mums, but we're working with lots of young dads and there's just no evidence about them. So a similar process to what I was seeing. We're hearing about these guys, we're hearing all these bad things, but we don't actually have any qualitative or rich data or even quantitative data actually about how many young dads there are and what their experiences are. So she shifted that whole project to a focus on young fathers, which in policy terms is young men aged 25 and under, although that's an interesting one because some people in their 30s still consider themselves to be young, and it's a subjective thing as just as much as a policy based factor as well. But for me, what's been so fascinating is that when you're under a certain age, the welfare system and the family policy system we have in the UK intensifies the hardship or the ability to become independent as a family. So we've got in the UK welfare rights that are age based. So being able to have a certain level of pay if you're under 25 is based on the fact that you don't have any dependents and the assumption that you might have parental support and that you're living with them. So the way in which our policies frame that particular group is very problematic. So I was very interested in that really. But as much as I focus on young fathers, I have empirically, that is, so I've done the research with those young fathers. The idea of father inclusion for me is very relevant to all fathers. And my genuine belief based on the evidence that we've been generating is if we can get it right for the most disadvantaged and marginalised young fathers in society, we're more likely to get it right for all fathers. So that starts from things like extended parental leave and paternity leave for fathers, making that available to those who are self-employed or on zero-hour contracts, for example. It's about workplaces and employment as well. So valuing fatherhood in those spaces by recognising them as caregivers. But then in the broader context of social services, of public health, family hubs, whatever that might be, it's about recognising men as dads and engaging with them in a caring and compassionate way, rather than seeing them always as a risk. And I say that because it's really important that we have robust risk assessment for parents and for families. But again, it's about seeing and hearing men so that we can support them, we can support the wider family, and to ensure that we create the conditions where men can be involved and they do want to be. That's what's so apparent in all of the research across the past decade and a bit. These men want to be there, they want to be caregivers. It's increasingly culturally expected, but we need to provide the conditions for them to do that, and we don't always.
I'm really interested in the work of Richard Reeves, who's been talking about the idea of masculinity being framed in a non-helpful fashion, with toxic masculinity not being a useful term. I like his philosophy of immature versus mature masculinity. So it's not fragile, it's durable. And how that feeds into a lot of our social expectations. So for me, my wife is the higher earner of the two of us, has been. And when it came to us having our second child, enhanced maternity kicked in. But for us to be able to take shared parental leave we would have to have sacrificed enhanced maternity, gone all the way back down to statutory, which meant that even though I wanted to get involved and I had capacity to get involved, and it was a more sensible decision for me to get involved financially speaking, the system wasn't set up to allow me the same flexibility or to support our circumstances. And then the other one I have kind of mixed into that is you get a lot now about when these should be taken to be most beneficial for the child in different stages. So I'm intrigued by the fact that the biological impact of oxytocin on men versus women, of the bonding part, and the impact of the biological oxytocin on men is much more around tactile play. And that actually, if you're to choose a part where the caring responsibility more fits into dads, is actually as they start to become toddlers, where they're able to have that. There's some work now on whether there should be a staging potentially, which is reflected a lot in Scandinavian countries, being able to choose when you do it. So I'm quite intrigued on the kind of the attitudinal part, but also then how policy often looks for a perfect best practice example that applies to everybody, rather than flexibility, which creates complexity. I'm curious to get your opinion of, from the research, what actually does work well universally and what is better targeted.
Gosh, that's a really good question. From the perspective of my research, what is universal is dads want to be there. And what's really interesting about this area is that the demand for policy change is being culturally driven as opposed to the other way around. So just you saying you're a behavioural economist, I think that, normally we sort of think about policy as nudging behaviours, don't we? But it seems to me in this case that actually the behaviours that men are engaging with are demonstrate their willingness to be there and to engage in caregiving, but systems and services just aren't catching up. I'm all for flexibility and complexity to some extent. From an academic point of view, I'm not having to administer these things, but creating opportunities for parents to manage and navigate their work and care balance in their own way, I think is really important. I was part of another study conducted with some colleagues at the University of Lincoln. It's called Caregiving Dads, Breadwinning Mums, and we looked at or we compared couples with different sort of commitments or levels of commitment to gender equality, and we had couples who were in sort of traditional breadwinner caregiver roles where mum was caregiver, dad was breadwinner. The opposite of that, so dads were main caregiver, mum was breadwinner, and then people who had a relatively even split of work care balance. And across all of those, especially the first two, so where you had mum as breadwinner and or equal caregiver, that shift straight into very what was being called by academics as a retraditionalisation of roles was really problematic for them. So the opportunity to have some choice around when and where they could take their leave and at what point would have been really important for them to manage, I think, that disruption in what they'd already established as a pattern of parental arrangement. Just in terms of attitudinal the attitudinal question, I mean, again, I would push back on this idea of toxic masculinity as well. I think I think that's again a very individualized argument, and it speaks to specific types of behavior and not to men as evolving and reacting within context and making decisions and being pushed in different directions. So again, I think we need to lean into the fact that men are choosing fatherhood as a way of portraying and even developing kind of healthier, I'd use language of healthy, I think, rather than immature or mature. So behaviours that are all about care for others, care for partners, care for themselves as well, and that sort of shift away from violence and maybe self-harming behaviours. But this is never just a gendered question. It's always about class and economics as well, and it's intersectional. So there are some men who will have the opportunities, I think, to make more choice around leave because of their economic status and or the industry that they're working within. But unless we create opportunities that work across industries and work across systems, then we're always going to have that inequality, and that's always going to reproduce perceptions, certainly, or actual realised gender inequalities among parents that then become embedded.
I'm a great fan of the book by Paul Morgan Bentley, the Equal Parent. It was a fascinating one to read when he took gender completely out of the equation. If that primary caregiver, secondary caregiver split forms, which I have to admit is one of my most hated terms in all forms of policy, because it places a value judgment on one part of the parenting unit, if it is even a dual parenting unit.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued about this idea of, like, you hear a lot about the way to impact most on beneficial futures of children is role models and mentors, which I fundamentally believe have a big role. But I'd be quite curious to hear about if there are particular, like, you hear a lot within class being an argument moment, which has a huge part to play. And I really like anybody who raises the term intersectionality, because it is such a big factor. I'm curious to understand a little bit more about where that has the most impact, and if there's not necessarily a silver bullet, but what are the things where those interventions or learnings actually have the best outcome, if you look at it longitudinally. So, is it a case where education in schools, as we hear a lot now, put more and more into the RHSE or the PHSE curriculum? Is that a wasted opportunity? Is it better to do it antenatally? Is it too late to do it postnatally? For those who are becoming fathers and mothers, new parents, is it ever too late to learn something that's going to change it, or is there some time or something that gives you, a better outcome chance?
Yeah, I mean, for me, we need preventative support as much as sort of intervention when things are in crisis, and that's kind of the more extreme end, I guess. But we absolutely need a literacy around what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, or to be a human, a human being, really, to shift it away from gender again. I was part of a project called Beyond Male Role Models when I was working at the Open University. This was in 2012, 2014. Again, we sort of critique this idea that male role models are sort of the only solution, and then potential kind of cause as well of some of the challenges that boys and young men are facing. And what we need, and I think what I've seen across all of these studies, is we need ecosystemic change. So we need everyone, regardless of what institutional context or organisational context you're working in, to recognise and value care, and to recognise that men and women, as human beings, are all capable of care. We don't value care economically. So, a lot of kind of feminist history is about unpaid labour and the costs of that for women, particularly because we've gendered those two different elements. And that extends over time and longitudinally. But yeah, if we're talking about fatherhood, healthy masculinities, positive masculinities in schools, in RSE. We're shifting beyond just a focus on contraception and the very technical elements of relationships to a focus on intimacies and what it means to be in a relationship with other people, regardless of gender. Then we're able to counteract some of the more negative discourses, some of the online things that has been raised by adolescents, and that are creeping into our homes. And I do think it's that literacy around love and care, the recognition that that is part of manhood, masculinity, and it's not something to be shamed or ashamed of. It is essentially what we're going to need in terms of when boys become fathers or men become fathers. Yeah, right from the outset, as soon as a pregnancy is disclosed and people are aware of that, ensuring that services are engaging with dad as well, asking about dad, not just to assess risk, but to see how dad is, to think about his own mental health, but to re-embed the fact that being a father is an important thing, and that it is an important identity, and something that these men will benefit from longer term. Because there's no one, regardless of how much money they have told me that they don't love their kids or don't want to be there for their kids. That is fundamental. So how do we replicate the fundamental nature of love and care, compassion, through our policies and systems? And part of that is professional training, and again, there's a lack of investment in that nationally, particularly around father inclusion. But also it is about funding, and having a coherent policy as well. So at the minute we have a very fragmented set of access to support and funding. So we lose memory about what works in supporting fathers. Professionals don't have the time to build relationships of trust with fathers as well, and then the core business becomes mums, because mum is the one presenting with the medical need, particularly during childbirth, and prenatally. So it's about kind of the social skills, but then also the resource and the funding behind that to make sure that we can develop this and help it to work.
In terms of influencing policy and practice, in the past couple of years, you've set up the Centre for Innovation in Fatherhood and Family Research at the University of Lincoln. Can you just briefly tell us a little bit about the centre, some of the work you're doing, and a bit about the Father Inclusion Hub as well that you've launched recently?
Yeah, definitely. So I talked earlier about my UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship. So that started in January 2020 and is a 7-year programme. The idea of the centre was to sort of build from my expertise and create something that's more collaborative and interdisciplinary. So what I mean by that again is that we explore father inclusion in a range of different contexts, from as wide as education, early help, nurseries, any area where we can support people as families essentially. So the centre is all about bringing in future researchers and training up future researchers. I've got a PhD student looking at young fathers in education currently. There's no parental leave available to young men who are still at school, for example, or in higher education. So she's looking at that. I've got a new student starting who's going to be looking at young fathers and their experiences of sleep or lack of sleep when men first become a parent. So there's a whole range of areas where we can look at father inclusion, and I can't do that on my own. So while I'm interested in kind of thinking theoretically about father inclusion and how we embed that across systems, we also need the evidence base to keep ensuring that is driven by what is going on in the real world, and ensuring there's enough people and resource to be able to do that. Attached to that is the Father Inclusion Hub. So that's a website that I've developed with the funding and that sits alongside the centre. And that's a growing archive of examples of good practice in how to be father inclusive. Again, multi-sector. So we're currently reaching out to dads groups across the UK, as well as organisations in public health, social services, who are either doing research and or delivering groups that support fathers effectively. And the idea is that we retain institutional memory. So when people move on or get new jobs or funding ends, that we don't keep reinventing the wheel all the time. And a classic example is the Sure Start and Family Hub sort of reinvigoration. Sure Start was evaluated in 2003, and there's a really great report. Charlie Lamb, I think it was, and Margaret O'Brien, who basically talked about what works in the family hubs, what works in Sure Start. And I presented that at a Family Hubs conference a year ago, and nothing's changed in terms of the fundamentals of what works in supporting fathers. So it's a site where people can go along, use the templates, all open access. We just ask for a login just so we can get a sense of who this is interesting to and who wants to know more. We also could offer training and consultancy as well through the centre now. So if people want us to come in and talk about how to be father inclusive or evaluate services, then we can offer that as well. So again, all about evidence base and working collaboratively and developing dialogues as part of the system, so that it's not just one person trying to change the world, it's the village.
Yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic resource.
Talking about the village there, Anna, you work with a lot of really good partners on the Father Inclusion Hubs. Who does things really well? Do you have community examples of people who, are doing incredibly good things that people should know more about? And also, what would be kind of your top advice for a new and expectant dad or parent?
Well, on the first half of the question, there are so many. I wish there was more, because again, it's a postcode lottery, and I'm really worried I'm going to miss some people. But in terms of specific specialised support for young fathers, I have to mention North East Young Dad and Lads. I'm a chair of trustees for that charity, and they're doing some incredible work with young dads, both one-to-one and bespoke support, but also peer support, and they do a lot of work with researchers as well. So they've been able to access kind of a lot of resource through working with researchers. And we've been able to co-create with that group. We've done peer research with them, and we looked at how we support minoritized fathers more effectively through services. And we've also co-created a resource called DigiDad, which is an online e-learning platform that's been developed with and for young fathers, and they voice over, and there's videos and animations, and it's fabulous, and it covers a whole range of different areas of parenting. Again, nationally, organisations like Future Men do a huge amount of work with fathers and a lot of campaigning and advocacy work, and they were the chairs of the all-party parliamentary group on fatherhood when that existed. So that brought discussions around policy and practice to policies, to national policymakers. In Edinburgh, there's Fathers Network Scotland, there's Dad's Rock, so again, there's a whole range of different organisations. Dad's Matters as well. But again, funding these things is not easy. There's a lot that can be learned from sort of, particularly from third sector and voluntary organisations, and is translatable to public health. And again, there's lots of father inclusion in those contexts as well. But there's still a lot of demand for training and thinking about how we do that more effectively. Remind me of your second part of the question. Sorry.
So it's if you were being asked by a new expecting parent, or even a new and expecting parent, it doesn't have to be gendered in any way. What do you, from your research, kind of point them towards the things to lean into and the things to avoid?
I think communication with partner, working out who you want to be as parents together, whether you're in a relationship or not, is absolutely key. I think recognition that there's a lot in society that tries to divide men and women on the basis of gender. But again, actually what we have in common is being human, and having our children, and learning from our own parents and the generations that came before us, if we're lucky enough to have that. So I think it's about trying to identify what we have in common with one another, communicate through the challenging times. I'm a mum. I've got a nearly 12-year-old girl, 6-year-old boy. I've been sleep deprived, struggled to go back to work. I don't think as a society we support new parents well at all. But I think, again, communicating with organisations about that, seeking to encourage organisations to be aware of some of the challenges that men and women are both facing as parents is really key. But the main thing is doing what's in the best interest of the child, always, I think. And that's not always easy, because they're not always easy. But if you can sort of keep that to the fore, then ultimately you'll have better outcomes for yourself and in terms of your relationships as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much for your time, Anna. We'll put links to the Father Inclusion Hub in the show notes. But thanks really very much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for the time to share what I'm doing.
That was Professor Anna Tarrant. I thought a really interesting conversation, Chris. I don't know about you, but I was particularly interested in, when she was talking about her own grandfather and the conversations which she'd had with, members of that generation about the differences of having children, about how actually involved they were in their own kids' lives, and actually how they're relishing the second opportunity they've got with their grandchildren.
Yeah, it's the intergenerational ones is always fascinating with me to hear more about how that plays out more societally. And again, one of the things we'll talk and delve into over the series is what the value is of that community of where you can find support and information, and not necessarily what good looks like, just what where to go to find the bits that are maybe missing in your available community and village, so to speak.
Yeah. Really interesting. We'll put some links to Anna's work and the Father Inclusion Hub in the show notes. And we'll be back next week with another really fantastic interview. Father Z is produced by Gemma Lothian, Chris Marchant and Paul Rhodes. It's edited by Paul Rhodes. Our music is by Christos Politis. You can find information, guidance and support on our website, fathercraft.co.uk. That's also where you can sign up to our Father Z platform, read our blog and find product reviews. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and leave us a 5-star rating so other dads can find us. It really does help. Thanks for listening.